Morning, everybody. I'm happy to call this hearing to order, recognize my ranking member, Chuck Grassley, members of the committee, thank our witnesses for being here, particularly Governor John Bel Edwards of Louisiana. It's a great honor having you with us. And welcome everyone to the 10th in our series on the enormous economic dangers of climate change for the federal budget. In the last month, we've seen the hottest temperatures ever recorded. Louisiana, I think, probably knows something about that. But Phoenix set a record for the most consecutive days above 110 degrees. Smoke from unprecedented Canadian wildfires has blanketed huge swaths of the United States. Storms in Vermont, New York, and Pennsylvania have triggered deadly flooding. And the worst drought in the Midwest in over a decade is threatening corn and soybean production and pushing up consumer prices. Climate change brings climate danger, climate risk, and climate inflation, and this is only the beginning. Today, we examine the climate costs to infrastructure. Infrastructure is the foundation of our economy: drinking water and sewage systems, roads, bridges, railways, irrigation, flood levees, waterways, power plants, dams, transmission lines, all enable our society to run. In addition to development and financing costs, each of these systems has maintenance and operating costs. Increased temperatures, higher sea levels, and greater variability in precipitation translate into shorter asset lifespans and higher ongoing expenses. In Texas, Oregon, and Utah, intense heat is buckling roadways. In Chicago, Seattle, and other major cities, bridges are being doused with water to keep heat from warping the metal. Coastal areas suffer erosion, saltwater intrusion, and flooding. 7,500 miles of East Coast roadway is in high tide flood zones, and more than 60,000 miles of roads and bridges are vulnerable to extreme storm damage. Just the direct damage to roads is estimated to cost nearly $20 billion each year, not counting the associated depression of economic activity. Our power grids are seeing record-breaking demand and reduced power efficiency, as well as added sea level rise risks where infrastructure, especially thermal power plants, is located along the coast. Extreme weather is responsible for 78% of the major disruptions to our power system. Since 2015, the frequency of major blackouts has doubled. In an average year, power outages caused by extreme weather events have cost the U.S. up to $44 billion. In years with record-breaking storms like 2008's Hurricane Ike, power outage costs soared to $99 billion. And last year, extreme drought in the Midwest dropped water levels in the Mississippi River so low that barges got stuck. Nearly all U.S. agricultural exports and more than 75% of the world's exports of feed grains and soybeans come from the Mississippi River basin. And the lack of water caused shipping delays, higher costs to find alternative transport, and reduced local economic activity. More climate inflation. Both the accumulating shifts in normal weather and the sudden catastrophes are putting economic stress on states, counties, municipalities, and the federal government, as well as ratepayers and taxpayers. Economists find that major hurricanes, for instance, reduce local governments' revenues by 7.2% in the decade following a hurricane, and are associated with a 13% drop in public works expenditures. We have heard repeated testimony that climate, economic, and physical hazards intersect. Today, we will hear that infrastructure systems are also interdependent, that failure in one system will cascade across other sectors. For instance, Louisiana's power outages after Hurricane Ian cascaded into wastewater failures at pumping stations, spilling millions of gallons of waste into local bodies of water. Already, we don't invest enough in our infrastructure. The power sector is a prime example. Congestion in our electric transmission system cost an estimated $20.8 billion last year alone. Price of congestion. Before passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the American Society of Civil Engineers estimated our infrastructure funding gap at $10.3 trillion and would cost 3 million jobs by 2039, even without the additional burdens of climate change. Climate change presents two public policy imperatives. First, we must zero out emissions by 2050 to avoid even worse dangers for our planet and human way of life. And second, we must withstand the warming and weather we are already experiencing that is locked in. A low-carbon economy will require thousands of miles of transmission lines, new zero-carbon sources of power generation, much more high-speed rail, new hydrogen and CO2 pipelines, facilities for critical minerals, and more. I appreciate very much that Ranking Member Grassley has invited an expert on permitting to testify today, as figuring out how to build out this infrastructure quickly and equitably will be a key challenge of the next few decades. Similarly, if we don't want to have to spend tens of billions of dollars rebuilding and rebuilding roads, bridges, sewage systems, levees, and other infrastructure damaged by climate-related extreme weather, we're going to have to figure out how to build smarter and better. The good news is that these investments to bolster our infrastructure create jobs, promote economic growth, and are cost-effective. Many states recognize this value. Louisiana's legislature passed all 4 of its coastal master plans unanimously. Let me close by recognizing Ranking Member Grassley for Iowa's leadership on wind power. 64% of Iowa's energy production now comes from wind, a new record for the state, and I believe a record among states for the country. We will need the kind of leadership of Iowa on wind power or Louisiana on coastal resiliency if we are to tackle the climate danger before it's too late. Repeatedly, this committee has heard expert testimony about the massive economic and fiscal costs of dawdling. Those dangers are clear and present. I hope that the message is getting through. This is real. Senator Grassley.
Before I begin my opening statement, I want to go back to a discussion that we had in this committee at the last hearing. It was a climate hearing. On your side of the aisle, it was touted a September 2021 IMF working paper on fossil fuel subsidies. This paper supposedly bolsters the view that climate catastrophe is on the horizon. You explicitly called it a peer-reviewed in order to support the case. On page 2 of that paper in question reads, quote, IMF working papers describe research in progress by the authors and are published to elicit comments and to encourage debate. The views expressed in the IMF working papers are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the views of the IMF, its executive board, or IMF management, end of quote. Dr. Roger Pilkey, a nonpartisan climate scientist who has testified at the invitation of both Democrats and Republicans, provided further insight on this study in response to a question for the record. I asked him in that question for the record if a meeting between the IMF director and Democratic senators has any bearing on whether an IMF working paper is peer-reviewed. He responded, quote, the IMF working paper would be properly called a preprint in scientific community. That is, not the equivalent of a peer review paper, end of quote, and then further quoting. Any single peer-reviewed paper is typically a small contribution to knowledge of a particular topic. Most papers offer less than that, end of quote. He then further followed up by saying, quote, peer-reviewed literature provides an ample resource for those who might wish to cherry-pick those individual articles that might seem to offer the best support for a preferred position. This may be useful in political advocacy or posturing, but it does not offer a reliable route to effective analysis that might inform policy, end of quote. If the committee is to continue focusing on climate change, it's important that we listen to nonpartisan scientists rather than speculate with international bureaucrats. Now on to my opening statement.
Well, may I respond to that?
Yes, you
just
sure
briefly?
can.
Because we actually had the president of the IMF in for a briefing to the Budget Committee. Every member was invited. No member on your side chose to attend. The president walked through how this worked, and she said that The methodology of that IMF report is in fact peer-reviewed, but because it is done repeatedly, they don't peer-review each individual report, but she confirmed that the methodology is in fact peer-reviewed. And second, she made very clear that the IMF does endorse and support and stand behind those reports. So if, sadly, nobody was there to see her say that, but that is what she said, and please go ahead with the rest of your statement.
Okay. Our nation is over $32 trillion in debt, yet this committee is holding the 11th hearing on climate change. President Biden is on television bragging about his economic performance when Americans can't afford groceries and gasoline. Our spending is out of control, and Democrats haven't written a budget in the past 2 years. As I've said many times, climate change is a topic very worthy of discussion. I'm the father of the wind energy tax credit, as you said about Iowa getting so much of our electricity from wind. I fought for renewable energy long before climate change became such a political popular topic. Democrats called this hearing to discuss the fiscal impact of climate change on the infrastructure. I imagine we'll hear some expensive estimates and alarming anecdotes about the impact of severe weather events on infrastructure, but there isn't a single expert in this room who is qualified as a climate scientist to attribute those estimates and anecdotes explicitly to climate change. However, several panelists are more than capable of discussing major policy issues, like our broken federal permitting system, which continues to impede critical infrastructure projects. These projects would make our infrastructure more resilient to weather, stronger for everyday use, and would reduce emissions. But environmental permitting delays caused by environmental groups and friends in Congress continue to drive up federal infrastructure spending along with the energy bills and taxes of our constituents. This is why I'm excited to welcome Mrs. Apsey. She's president and CEO of ITC Holding, the largest independent electricity transmission company in the United States. ITC operates more than 6,600 circuit miles of transmission lines in Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, and Missouri. As head of a company that actually is building infrastructure, Mrs. Apsey will highlight the real reasons why our electric grid is in peril and why we are unable to complete transmission projects like the Cardinal Hickory Creek one in Dubuque County, Iowa. Her testimony is one that my friends on the other side of the aisle simply don't want to hear, while accusing the fossil fuel industry of corruption and accusing those they disagree with of criminal activity. Their support astronomically unrealistic electric vehicles and renewable energy goals, but they're unwilling to support reform to environmental legislation like NEPA and the Clean Water Act, which impede the construction of the same infrastructure necessary to even attempt to meet those goals. Few experts understand this better than Mr. Hergott, President and CEO of the Permitting Institute. He worked to limit permitting delays for infrastructure projects while at the White House, where he served as both Executive Director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council and Director of Infrastructure at the Council of Environmental Quality. Mr. Hergott will show us that the Democrats' grand vision of renewable energies are just that, unless they reverse the course as their disastrous permitting positions. From Iowa to Rhode Island, our nation's roads, bridges, waterways, and energy infrastructures are essential to America's economy, trade, and vitality. I'm sure all of us here, as well as those senators on EPA and Energy Natural Resource Committees, can agree that we can work together to craft legislation to improve our national infrastructure in order to reduce our ballooning national debt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Grassley. I'm very pleased to have a distinguished panel of 5 reputable and serious witnesses before us today. First is the 56th governor of the state of Louisiana, John Bel Edwards. As I noted in my opening remarks, Louisiana, under the governor's leadership, is acting to address the pervasive and serious challenge that climate change presents to infrastructure, particularly along its highly vulnerable coastlines. Thank you, Governor Edwards, for taking time to join us today. Your presence underscores the importance of our hearing. Our second witness is the Honorable Dr. Susan Tierney. Dr. Tierney is a senior advisor with the Analysis Group, an economic, financial, and strategic consulting company. Previously, she served as the Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Energy. In Massachusetts, she was the Secretary of Environmental Affairs, Commissioner at the Department of Public Utilities, and Director of the state's Energy Facilities Siting Council. Our third witness is Dr. Jesse Keenan, an Associate Professor of Sustainable Real Estate and Urban Planning at Tulane University. That makes two Louisianans here. We're doing strong. His research focuses on the intersection of climate change adaptation and the built environment, including aspects of design, engineering, regulation, planning, and financing. He also serves as a senior economist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Research and Development Center's Environmental Lab. Following Dr. Keenan is Mrs. Linda Apsey, the president and CEO of ITC Holdings Corp., the largest independent electricity transmission company in the U.S. Its regulated subsidiaries include ITC Transmission, Michigan Electric Transmission Company, ITC Midwest, and ITC Great Plains, through which it owns and operates high-voltage transmission infrastructure in Michigan, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma, with development underway in Wisconsin. Our final witness is Alex Hergott, President and CEO of the Permitting Institute, which focuses on accelerating investment in infrastructure of all types. During the prior administration, Mr. Hergott served as Executive Director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council and as Associate Director for Infrastructure at the Council on Environment Quality. Thank you all for joining us today. Governor, the floor is yours to deliver your opening remarks. Everyone's complete statement will be made a matter of record, so please honor the 5-minute rule.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Whitehouse and Ranking Member Grassley and all the members. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I know there are a lot of coastal champions on this committee, and I appreciate each and every one of you, and that includes Senator Kennedy. As Governor of Louisiana, I have devoted considerable time to one of the most pressing issues of our day, and that is climate change. As you'll see from my full written statement, there are many lessons for Louisiana to share with this committee, and we don't pretend that we've mastered this subject matter and that we get it all right, but we have learned an awful lot of lessons, and I think we're doing some good work. We've experienced significant devastation in our recent history from hurricanes, floods, sea level rise, subsidence, coastal land loss, habitat degradation, and extreme heat. Because we've been tested more than anywhere else in the country, Louisiana has gone to great lengths to increase the resilience of our communities, our economy, and our ecosystem. Following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, the state crafted and the legislature unanimously approved the first comprehensive master plan for a sustainable coast in 2007. Since then, we've updated the plan 3 more times, most recently this May. The Coastal Master Plan is a $50 billion, 50-year roadmap that prioritizes our investments in coastal infrastructure. The plan reflects the best available science, accounting for changes on the ground and forecasting what is at risk in our future. It recommends major investments in levee protection, home elevations, and ecosystem restoration. Importantly, if our coastal master plan is fully implemented, we could have less at risk in 50 years than we do today. The plan also shows how unacceptable a future without action could be, as we would lose thousands of square miles of land and increase Louisiana's annual risk by close to $25 billion. To put that in perspective, our state general fund is less than $12 billion on an annual basis. Of course, Louisiana is already building infrastructure to mitigate climate risk and increase resilience. Our experience proves that such investments do in fact pay off. The $14.5 billion federal and state investment in the Greater New Orleans Hurricane and Storm Damage Risk Reduction System was put to that test by Hurricanes Isaac, Barry, Zeta, and most recently, and the most powerful of all of those, Hurricane Ida. The system works, and it saved federal treasury billions of dollars in recovery expenses. Louisiana Highway 1 is another example. We're elevating a 19-mile stretch of two-lane Highway 22, of highway 22 feet above the marsh to avoid increasingly frequent flooding. This road is a vital evacuation route. It's also an essential transportation link to the nation's energy sector to Port Fourchon, which more than 90% of all of the Gulf of Mexico oil and gas production and exploration is actually serviced out of that port. And each day the highway is closed, it costs the U.S. about $46 billion in lost energy production and $528 million in foregone gross domestic product. Now, this is an $850 million project, and that's expensive, but it pales in comparison to the cost of inaction. We're also addressing the direct impact our residents experience from climate risk through a widespread effort of home elevations and voluntary buyouts in repetitive flood areas. We recently completed the relocation of the Ile de Jean Charles Native American community to a more resilient housing in a more sustainable part of Terrebonne Parish. We're working with the Army Corps of Engineers on a $300 million elevation program in southwest Louisiana. And we're conducting 7 other buyout programs across the state through our watershed initiative. By proactively moving residents out of harm's way, we can sustain communities, increase equity for disadvantaged residents, lower insurance premiums, and restore the natural function of the floodplains. These projects all required partnership with the federal government and funding from both state and federal sources, because we need greater partnership and increased funding to construct more resilient infrastructure. And I commend the chairman and other members who have co-sponsored the RISE Act. By sharing energy revenue with impacted coastal states, RISE will enable those states to make proactive investments to combat challenges from the changing climate, which would save the American people and the federal government money in the long run. We are an energy state, no doubt about that. In 2020, I created the Climate Initiatives Task Force to develop a climate action plan. Achieving buy-in took substantial community and stakeholder engagement, 15 months, 49 public hearings, and the input of 150 stakeholders. But we unanimously adopted a plan to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This is the only such plan in the Gulf South. We're already seeing results since adoption in 2022. The Climate Action Plan has attracted more than $26 billion in low-carbon economic development to the state of Louisiana, and it also guided our pursuit of IIJA and IRA funding. And, Mr. Chairman, again, I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to answering the questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Governor. I turn now to Dr. Tierney.
Good morning, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for inviting me to testify this morning, and I have 2 main points. First, as we have just heard, the nation's energy infrastructure is already being adversely impacted by the changing climate. Second, given the nation's dependence on well-functioning energy infrastructure, this is leading to great suffering, both directly by increasing costs, disrupting heating and cooling, and indirectly by disrupting electricity services and causing energy prices to spike. Given the Budget Committee's jurisdiction, I focus today on describing these circumstances rather than the solutions. Every day, the news highlights the many ways in which our country is being hit by extreme weather. These circumstances are not surprising, but they are challenging. For example, in December 2022, Winter Storm Elliott across the country took out power to hundreds of thousands of Americans, a fourth of PJM's generating capacity across a 13-state region in the area between Chicago and the mid-Atlantic states. Most of that was gas-fired power plants, accounting for 70% of the outages due to equipment and fuel problems. Texas in February 2021, Winter Storm Uri brought extreme severe cold and ice. Electricity prices spiked to 100 times their normal levels, leaving many consumers with unbearable electricity bills. Over 246 people died. Financial losses ranged from 80 to 130 billion. In 2019, in Northern California, the utility's proactive electricity shutoffs during high wildfire risk conditions to over 1 million customers cost $2 billion. Hurricane Katrina in August 2005, 1/3 of domestic U.S. production, 1/6 of domestic U.S. natural gas production, and nearly 10% of the nation's refining capacity was offline. An estimated 4.5 million customers in Louisiana and Mississippi lost electrical power. U.S. oil and gas prices were double their normal levels for months, and it raised the national cost of natural gas on the order of $50 billion in the 10 months after the storm. Even a decade ago, the Department of Energy estimated that power outages due to severe weather cost the nation between $24 and $44 billion a year. That's adjusted for inflation. Such effects of the changing climate were detailed in the energy chapters of the most recent National Climate Assessment. For example, and I'm quoting here, "The reliability, security, and resilience of the energy system underpins virtually every sector of the U.S. economy. The nation's energy system is already affected by extreme weather events. Due to the changing climate, the energy system is projected to be increasingly threatened by more frequent, longer-lasting power outages, affecting critical energy infrastructure and creating fuel shortages. Widespread energy disruptions can take weeks to fully resolve at sizable economic cost. The petroleum, natural gas, and electrical infrastructure along the East and Gulf coasts are at extreme increased risk of damage." This is from the 2018 assessment still. This vulnerable infrastructure serves other parts of the country, so regional disruptions are projected to have national, long-lived implications. Now, the upcoming 5th National Climate Assessment will surely point to the worsening conditions on energy infrastructure and on disadvantaged communities across the country. In closing, I encourage Congress to act swiftly to address the emissions that are the root cause of climate change and its adverse impacts on American infrastructure and citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Keenan, please proceed.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. In my remarks today, I'd like to outline how climate-attributed physical impacts impose increasingly burdensome financial, capital, and operational costs for taxpayers, consumers, and infrastructure providers. The United States is facing increased electricity production costs in the order of $50 billion a year by 2050. This figure does include increased costs for cooling buildings, charging cars, increased demand for water recycling, pumping drinking water farther distances, water desalination, and increased agricultural irrigation. Additional costs for extreme weather like hurricanes and wildfires are among a wide variety of direct costs that will continue to be passed on to utility ratepayers. As a resident of New Orleans, my own electric utility only a few years ago just removed a bill surcharge for post-Hurricane Katrina 13 years after the fact. In the transportation sector, physical impacts have been widely observed for everything from extreme heat waves to flood events compromising roads, tarmacs, and rail lines, as well as pipelines. Annual direct damages for roads and rail impacts are estimated to be just under $20 billion a year by 2050. Increased operation and maintenance expenses for paving and resurfacing of roads is estimated to be approximately $19 billion at the end of this decade, a year. None of these cost estimates and projections account for the indirect costs for increased logistic costs, fuel costs, delay costs, and lost economic output. For instance, when the water is too high or too low on the Mississippi River, boat traffic delays have ripple effects in domestic and international food and grain markets. Within the water and wastewater sectors, annualized urban drainage infrastructure damages are estimated to be approximately $4 billion by 2050, with an additional $2 billion in costs associated with impairments to existing potable water systems. This latter figure does not account for the untold cost of adaptations to address water scarcity challenges facing the western United States, where with reduced irrigation, additional groundwater mining, and increased reservoir storage capacity posing significant additional costs. Most importantly, infrastructure is getting more expensive because the municipal bond market is beginning to price climate risk. When infrastructure providers issue general obligation bonds, Investors are concerned that a degraded tax base may impact the fiscal stability of the issuer over the term of the bond. This default risk is amplified for revenue bonds. For instance, if a toll road is washed out in the event of a climate event, then the payment of that bond may be compromised for as long as those tolls are not being paid. Recent research has highlighted that after disasters, local governments are more likely to issue these revenue bonds, and that post-disaster issuances are paying higher comparative yields. Increases in capital costs may also be attributed to increased construction costs for incorporating engineering resilience within assets. For instance, a flood mitigation system may have to build a higher levee with greater pumping capacity to accommodate future projected precipitation, storm surge, and sea level rise design standards. Operations and maintenance costs, O&M, from climate impacts are perhaps one of the most immediate cost burdens for infrastructure providers. Additional costs for things like greater energy expenses for pumping stormwater, more stormwater, that is, are all drags on the financial balance sheet of providers and increasingly cost burden ratepayers. Unfortunately, the United States is grossly behind in the codification of climate-sensitive design and engineering standards and on the life cycle cost accounting for evaluating the total cost of climate impairments over the useful life of these assets. As this country embarks on a new era of infrastructure investment, we have to ask ourselves some difficult questions. Are we designing today's infrastructure to handle tomorrow's load and tomorrow's environmental demand? In high-risk zones, that is high-risk impact zones, where will we invest and where will we disinvest in infrastructure? And finally, are we accounting and budgeting for the anticipated increased costs and operational expenses? Proper fiscal stewardship in the face of climate impacts will require stakeholders to work together to provide transparency and accountability. A failure to recognize and account for these costs will not only undermine our reliability of our infrastructure, it will undermine our global economic competitiveness. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Apsey?
Great, thank you, and good morning, Chair Whitehouse, ranking distinguished members of the committee. CEO of ITC Independent Transmission Company. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Next month marks the 20th anniversary of the Northeast blackout that left 50 million people in the dark. It was the largest blackout in North American history and a sobering reminder of how vulnerable our nation's energy security can be when we fail to adequately invest in transmission infrastructure. The investment the energy together that are years ago. Reliably. However, building transmission can take up to a decade, if not more, a pace nowhere near fast enough to meet the administration's clean energy goals. It's imperative that we examine changes to ensure that investment in transmission is predictable, timely, and cost-effective in order to realize the benefits of a modern transmission grid. While ITC has made significant investments interconnected network events are ever increasing, putting in an already fragile grid. The American Society for Civil Engineers gives our energy grid a C-, hardly an acceptable grade for today's needs. Our Midwest geography is no strange to weather that is impacting infrastructure all over the country. Our regions frequently experience ice storms, windstorms, and other natural disasters of increasing severity. In 2020, Iowa experienced a devastating derecho storm, causing widespread power outages. It was the equivalent of a 40-mile-wide tornado steamrolling across 200 miles of the state. Since that time, Iowa has experienced 2 additional derechos that have caused damage to electrical infrastructure. These storms, along with the recent extended heat waves across much of the U.S., demonstrate the importance of a resilient and reliable grid. To be done, plan, pay for, and how we permit. Makers should adopt transmission planning policies that capture and account for the full range of transmission benefits, not just the narrow definition of benefits that transmission is evaluated on today. Highly valuable regional transmission projects. Policymakers should also establish more robust interregional transmission planning standards, which can drive reliability and resilience across regions, particularly during severe weather conditions. And in addition, policymakers should continue to focus on streamlining permitting approval processes at both the state and federal level. Recently, Congress made progress by passing federal permitting reforms, but more needs to be done to decrease the amount of time it takes to obtain permits for major transmission lines and minimize the potential for multiple lawsuits and litigation. For example, MISO's Cardinal Hickory Creek project, a 102-mile transmission line from Dubuque, Iowa to Dane County, Wisconsin, is the last remaining project to be constructed in MISO's MVP portfolio from 2011. These projects were designed to deliver renewable energy to meet state renewable energy standards, provide access to lower cost generation, and enhance grid reliability. Over 100 renewable generation projects are awaiting completion of the Cardinal Hickory Creek project in order to interconnect to the grid, resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars in lost energy savings to customers. However, the project has been plagued by costly delays and permitting challenges due to the 1.3 miles that crosses federal land. The federal government and project owners recently won a major decision from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals that clears the way for the federal agencies to make their final decisions on the project. We stand ready to complete and energize the line. However, this is contingent on expeditious federal action review. The ability to effectively and efficiently make needed investments in our transmission grid will determine whether we can achieve our critical economic, security, and energy goals. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before the committee, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Our final witness is Mr. Hergott.
Chairman Whitehouse and Ranking Member Grassley, my name is Alex Hergott, and I'm president of the Permitting Institute and the former and first appointed executive director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. TPI is a federal and state-focused, nonpartisan nonprofit serving as an authoritative voice on permitting and a trusted expert resource and education partner for federal and state policymakers and regulators. Our diverse membership collectively support a common goal of accelerating infrastructure across all sectors. TPI members and staff speak from experience that comes from writing the laws in Congress, then developing projects, financing them, permitting them, citing them, and interacting with the government officials for implementing the myriad of laws, regulations, and guidelines that determine where, how, and when a project gets built. The reality is that every project that turns dirt, regardless of the sector that you care about, encounters habitat, alters landscape, creates unavoidable interactions with nature, triggering hundreds of reviews and regulations that govern infrastructure permits at the federal, state, and local level. As the chairman knows all too well, as you can see from the chart, is that infrastructure permitting is carried out by 13 agencies operating under the authority of dozens of statutes, some of which are more than 100 years old. The result is a permitting process mired with excessive delays and litigation risk that stifles investment. Now, the Energy Act of 2020, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS, IRA, they provided unprecedented funding for our nation's critical infrastructure. However, the omission of significant permitting reforms in this legislation is undermining one of the largest single federal investments in infrastructure since the Depression. While Congress has agreed on modest process reforms to achieve greater coordination and efficiency, these surface-level process changes have only served as Band-Aids and are not the necessary surgical cure. To be clear, interagency coordination and transparency, dashboards, executive orders, Whitehouse permitting action plans, and a strengthened federal permitting improvement steering council are very much needed. However, they are not the sufficient step to reduce the hundreds of billions of dollars in costs associated with infrastructure permitting across all sectors. Even with the subset of reforms in the Fiscal Responsibility Act just recently in the debt limit deal, which represent the most significant legislative changes to NEPA in 40 years, in practice, developers will still experience most of the same obstacles and avoidable process delays that have plagued this system for decades. Truly impactful legislation will have to move beyond macro-level NEPA changes and untangle the web of confusion and uncertainty in this chart. The challenges and costs inflicted by our broken permitting system do not discriminate by sector. Whether it was the extra 3 years on the Mid-Barrett Coastal Restoration Project, or as the chairman knows all too well, with offshore wind, in the last 2 years, the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council Executive Director has received and approved more than 17 requests from lead permitting agencies to extend the completion dates for at least 10 offshore wind projects on the dashboard, creating an additional 10 years that was not anticipated at the beginning of the permitting timetable. This is not unique to offshore wind. It's for traditional fossil fuel, broadband, water, you name it. The problem is getting worse, not better, at a time when we can least afford it. No one wins under the current system, not the companies on the front lines of transitioning the U.S. harnessing technology for greener energy generation and storage, not the environment, and not the majority of Americans that will bear the brunt of these increased energy and environmental costs. On average, project developers reported that 20 to 30% of total project cost is wasted on delays. All these costs are ultimately passed on to citizens, either through taxes, tolls, or increased rates and usage fees. It's not all bad news. We've seen glimpses of what sound reform can do, and there's an opportunity for lawmakers to build and expand on the reforms enacted over the last decade. But in order to do that, the process must be transparent. At present, outside of the Federal Permitting Council, some small issues at DOE and FERC, and the DOT projects tracked under one federal decision under the IIJA, there is no central repository and real-time tracking and the inventory and status of projects navigating their way through the federal agencies. The lack of process transparency allows for gamesmanship of 2-year timelines, and the lack of publicly available data prevents stakeholder engagement and our ability to accurately diagnose the problem. We don't need to hide the problems. This is not a Republican or a Democrat issue. It is a process issue we can fix. The beauty of transparency is that the facts now drive this debate, not hyperbole and posturing. The reality is that the last significant study of NEPA timelines was completed by the Council of Environmental Quality more than 5 years ago. Where's that study? While it can be convenient to blame faceless bureaucrats for delays and process problems, as someone who worked alongside the hardworking pioneers of the FIPSI dashboard and the thousands of dedicated project managers across the interagency process, I encourage Congress to refrain from such rhetoric. Instead, I challenge you to help me and others make public service the desired pathway by recognizing the talents required and the contributions of these agency professionals that make towards advancing America's infrastructure goals. TPI believes the majority of Republicans and Democrats in Congress favor a faster, more transparent, predictable, and accountable permitting process. But we first must collectively acknowledge that the modernization of what have often been called bedrock environmental laws will absolutely be required. Despite bipartisan agreement that the country's permitting process is broken, skepticism over the motivations behind the new legislative reform proposals, and the outside stakeholders, each prioritizing their narrow interests, and the fear of what a negotiated compromise may look like at the end of a conference or of a bill, it has inhibited additional reforms. However, I remain cautiously optimistic that reform is achievable. From our vantage point at TPI, we see staff from both sides of the aisle and from all sectors coming to us with the same challenge with their own version of a proposed solution. By providing technical assistance and connecting members and stakeholders with that shared interest, we at TPI are working to help build the bridge required for comprehensive reform that eliminates obstacles for all Americans' infrastructure development, not just the one that you care about. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hergott, and congratulations on a truly heroic effort to pack the maximum number of words into your 5-minute window. That was impressively done. And also thank you for your reference to offshore wind, which will take me to Governor Bell Edwards. First of all, thank you for your positive mention and for your support for the RISE Act. This will provide revenues to coastal states like yours. It will expand offshore wind, particularly in the Gulf. It will add the construction and manufacturing jobs associated with offshore wind and provide an economic hedge for the Gulf states against carbon bubble risk to state and local revenue. So I'm really grateful for your support. Tell me a little bit about what is happening along the Louisiana coast right now. What are you looking at?
With respect to wind or more broadly?
With respect to coastal
Yes, sir.
risk, coastal harms.
Well, you know, we are particularly challenged in Louisiana and have been for a long time. We've lost 2,000 square miles of land since 1930. Inaction going forward with sea level rise alone, we would lose another 3,000 square miles over the next 50 years. Of course, inaction is not, yes,
Grand
yes,
total 5,000 square
yes, sir.
miles.
But inaction's not an option, and in fact, that's not what we're doing. We have the country's most robust plan for coastal restoration and protection. We are investing mightily for a state our size. When in 2007, when we came up with a plan that said $50 billion over 50 years, there was nothing magical about it. We just couldn't imagine we would ever have more than $1 billion a year. And we said, okay, what would we do? We are actually on track. Last year, we spent $1.3 billion in our coast. This year will be $1.6 billion. And critically important is the RISE Act, because we constitutionally dedicate all of our federal offshore revenue for oil and gas production to our coast. But we, unlike interior states, we're limited to 37.5%, not 50%, capped at $375 million, and then it's shared among 4 states. So it's the RISE Act would address that, but more importantly for us, or at least significantly it would be, create a revenue sharing around wind, which would be critically important for Louisiana because we are going to develop wind. There's a lease sale going to happen next month off the coast of Louisiana by BOEM, but also we have 5 companies that are interested in state water wind development as well. So that's critically important. And Mr. Chairman, one of the things we have to start planning for is in 2031, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill damages that are funding the Mid-Barrett sediment diversion, for example, at almost $3 billion. Those funds go away. We really want to replace that to the extent that we can, at least, with wind energy revenue. So we've got a lot going on our coast, and like other states, you know, we've got 40% of our people live in South Louisiana now, and it's such a huge part of our economy. It's a special place for the country, not just for Louisiana, and we have a real sense of urgency about what we're doing, and I know you've been down there to see it, and I invite all the committee members to come and see what we're doing in Louisiana. I'm proud of our efforts, and I've traveled to the Netherlands and other places. What we're doing in Louisiana, it is on scale with anything happening anywhere in the world right now.
The infrastructure costs that you're bearing to adapt to and protect against climate change and sea level rise, I assume that the federal government is a partner in that, and some of those costs revert back to the federal government. What is the scale of the state and federal investment that you look forward to?
Well, first of all, the federal government has been a tremendous partner. If you just go back to Hurricane Katrina, with the failure of the federal levees around New Orleans, which really caused the enormous death and damage, there's been $14.5 billion of investment. Now, we have our share of that, and we're certainly meeting that. But that was borne by and large through the generosity of people all over the country, hugely important. The Corps of Engineers is engaged in 10 projects all over the state of Louisiana, primarily in the south, along the coast and along the river there, that will have tremendous impact. So yes, there's tremendous investment, but it is literally in the billions of dollars. These are not small investments. But one of the things that I'd like to point out, they are paying off. Hurricane Ida hit southeast Louisiana in 2021. It was stronger than Hurricane Katrina, and a very similar trajectory when it hit the state. Very little damage compared to Hurricane Katrina, and so those were cost saved. And I'm sitting here not just because of what's happened since I've been governor, but I firmly believe that these storm events are going to be more frequent and they're going to be more severe, and therefore the cost savings will be more frequent and they will be greater over time. Another example of this is a federal Corps authorized protection project in Morganza to the Gulf. Hurricane Rita in 2005, 9-foot storm surge in this area inundated 11,000 structures. The work that we did, Hurricane Barry, same area, 9-foot of storm surge, 11 structures. 11,000 versus 11. It costs a lot, but the savings accrue for a very long time. Now, we're having challenge getting FEMA to recognize all that work and have it reflected in the risk rating 2.0 premiums for the National Flood Insurance Program. That's another thing, but we know that these investments pay off over time and they produce savings, and it's so good for the economy and otherwise.
So big investments can be wise investments. My time has expired. Let me yield to Senator Grassley. I will have some questions for the record for the other witnesses, and there is time to turn around those answers, so please be ready for those questions for the record when they come in, and please respond timely. Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for your testimony. I'm going to start out with Mrs. Hapsey. President Biden's goal of making 50% of all new vehicle electric by 2030 and shifting to 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035. Most people believe that these goals are impossible to meet. Americans don't want and can't seem to afford the dramatic shift to expensive EVs, and 79% of the fossil fuel energy mix can't change overnight. So to you, let's take a moment to talk about the grid. Does the United States currently have the infrastructure in place to even come close to achieving Biden's renewable goals?
Great, thank you for the question. From a transmission infrastructure perspective, transmission serves multiple needs: access to the grid, reliability, resiliency, security, and ultimately, obviously, allowing electric vehicles or the electrification of our economy. However, our grid is not in a state even today to meet the current stresses on our grid, as we've talked about. And given the timeline to build, the time it takes to plan a transmission project to the time we actually put a transmission line into service, on average, if all goes well, it takes 7 years. I gave you an example of a project that has taken at least 12 years. So the challenge, I think, from a transmission infrastructure perspective is that while the utility sector has made significant strides in decarbonizing, I think we've gotten to about probably almost 50%, reduction in carbon. Sort of the remaining distance is the hardest to go.
I think you've answered that question well. You mentioned the Cardinal Hickory Creek Transmission Project from its delays because of environmental reviews. Why is it taken, hasn't 10 years been enough time to complete that project? Who's to blame in that regard?
Well, the project faced litigation from both local groups and national environmental groups that sought to litigate the portion of the project that crossed federal wildlife refuge. That was the 1.3 miles. And so it's been tied up in multiple court venues. And at the same time, we've been urging the federal agencies to continue to do the work so that when we received the outcome of the court ruling, we could be in a position to expeditiously move forward with the remaining construction on the project. At this time, we are still awaiting the federal agencies to take action on the remaining permits. While we're hopeful that we can now move to quick action, we're somewhat at the hands of the federal agencies.
Mr. Hergott, Biden has prioritized preferred green energy projects by government subsidies and concerted regulatory effort to what he calls to end fossil fuels. However, just like fossil fuel projects, renewable projects face years of permitting delays. Why shouldn't permitting reform be at the top list of anyone's concerned about climate change? And during your time at the administration, did you notice any renewable energy project delays stemming from Democrat inaction?
Thank you for that question, Senator. You know, I'm often perplexed at the situation we find ourselves in on the permitting debate. This isn't like gun control or social issues or Social Security or the science of climate change. This is an apolitical, science-based issue, and we're using the process as a rhetorical tool to stop the projects that you don't like. Is not an effective way in which to adjudicate which projects go where. And what we are seeing with comments that are coming from my friends in the administration that I work with when they say, we don't have a problem with NEPA. 95% of all NEPA reviews end up in a categorical exclusion. That is misleading, right? The reality is that most of those projects that are being talked about are smaller, lower level projects at the Department of Transportation and do not take into account these large scale energy projects, which is why when in the administration we had to put our finger on the scale on Vineyard Wind and several other projects to get the Department of Interior to accelerate the time of doing these regional EISs. And I think that what often we find in this situation is that we stop treating capital being put at risk to build all infrastructure as partners, and we started to look at them as adversaries. And I think that there's going to be a tremendous move to make this issue a truly bipartisan issue because of the $10 trillion investment in infrastructure right now. $8 billion is renewable energy, and on average, it is suffering about a 7 to 10 year delay. This is no longer a Republican issue, and I'm almost surprised in many ways that Republicans push permitting reform because it should be coming from the other side.
Governor, I'll have a question for you in writing. If you'd please respond to it, I yield.
Next, just for the information of my colleagues, after Senator Kane, it's Senator Johnson, Senator Padilla, and Senator Braun. And for the record, I have not given up hope on bipartisan permitting reform. My site bill on electric transmission is through the Environment Public Works Committee and has been in part of Chairman Carper's package. And we are finalizing the offshore wind bill, which we hope will be very bipartisan, and hope very much that we can get our committees to pass significant bipartisan permitting legislation that I hope will make all the witnesses happy. Senator Kane.
Thanks to the witnesses. It's great to be together with you. Virginia is a state that has very significant climate challenges. We have 5,000 miles of shoreline on the Atlantic and the Chesapeake Bay. Hampton Roads, 1.7 million people, is often listed second to New Orleans as the community in the United States, at least in the eastern part of the United States, most jeopardized by sea level rise. And in Appalachia, where the topography of these narrow hollows with streams at the bottom of them often lead to really significant storm events that wipe out infrastructure, wipe out people's homes. Interestingly, the rainfall in Appalachia on an annual basis isn't changing. It's just that it's coming much more episodically and violently, which poses real risks to infrastructure. So on this hearing on infrastructure, I'm kind of focused on three kinds of infrastructure in Virginia. First, climate affects the existing infrastructure road, the main road into the Norfolk Naval Base, our bridges, and when there's damage to that infrastructure, we've got to rebuild. Second, in order to deal with some of our climate risks, Governor Bell Edwards, I'm a big admirer of what you've done, and we're making a lot of resiliency investments in the same way that Louisiana has, so that sea level rise doesn't affect communities as much, but those resilience investments are infrastructure projects that have their own permitting requirements. And finally, Virginia is really finally embracing kind of clean energy with offshore wind, significant solar deployment, which requires its own infrastructure, particularly in the transmission space. I am very excited about the commitments that we have made. The American Rescue Plan, by putting money into state and local governments, a lot of that one-time money was used for infrastructure projects. That's great. The infrastructure bill, the CHIPS bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. But I've got two worries about our commitment to infrastructure. One is who's going to build it. I think we have some significant workforce challenges that we have to grapple with. On manufacturing, who's going to make it? With an unemployment rate that's so low, we need to do a lot on the workforce side. But the second is the permitting side. And I wanted to ask your opinions about this, if witnesses have opinions, and maybe Mr. Hurd, I would suspect you might have looked at this more closely than others. When we were talking about the Inflation Reduction Act last summer, there was a proposed 90-page permitting reform bill, and 85 pages of it was permitting reform, and then 5 pages of it was saying, but Mountain Valley Pipeline doesn't have to apply, doesn't have to go through any of this reform. I opposed the 5 pages at the end because I thought if we're going to fix our permitting process, then let everybody meet the standards. the will of my colleagues was to the contrary. So that MVP got a green light. That's water under the bridge. But I'm curious, did you analyze, just kind of from a starting standpoint, that 85-page permitting reform proposal? Some elements of it were included in the debt ceiling deal, but I think sort of modest elements were included. Just from a starting standpoint, I've been a little surprised, not on the committees, that effort hasn't come back before us, because like you, I think many Democrats want to do permitting reform. There is an E&R hearing going on right now on permitting reform issues. But did you look at that 85-page permitting reform proposal, and how would you grade it? What was good, what was bad, what wasn't in there that should be there?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that in the IIJA bill and EPW, many of those reforms were codified on the DOT side. The fact that that just wasn't a rubber stamp coming out of Congress is remarkable to me. But the importance is that we're tinkering on the edges. Creating deadlines allows for gamesmanship on the front end on deemed approves and might get you sooner to a no rather than a yes. Creating page limits, a 400-page or a 500-page EIS is not the reason why projects are getting delayed 2 to 4 to 5 to 6 years. Those are helpful process changes. We need those. But that is because we are unwilling to acknowledge that we're going to have to open up the Clean Water Act, written 50 years ago, 30 years before the internet. We're going to have to open up the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We're going to have to open up these legacy bedrock environmental statutes. And in the political climate right now, in the House and the Senate, I don't blame either side for seeing ghosts and what the intentions are on both sides, but the fact remains that the shared pain on both sides means that when I look at that bill, I go, this is great. This is going to solve a good amount of interagency coordination issues. I hope it doesn't absolve the urgency and the imperative of us going deeper and actually fixing the problem. So I wanted it, but I also wanted it next year and the year after that and the year after that, because the reality here is even the fights about making a project take 2 years and that being objected to is interesting to me, considering that we now have AI and natural language processing and technology issues that can help us arrive at the objective standard for qualified project managers to make subjective decisions on projects, which is why even in the coastal Virginia offshore wind projects, the 6-month delay that just occurred 2 months ago is frustrating to me, just because National Marine Fisheries Service, Fish and Wildlife, and the Corps can't get on the same page. That has nothing to do with the environmental laws, the interagency coordination. They have natural conflicts between their laws that force them to delay the project. It has nothing to do with environmental protection or justice or any of that. It's pure conflict.
So I take your assessment of the 85-page bill as helpful but not sufficient. Thank you, Mr.
I get paid by the word. I apologize.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems to me that the overall question we ought to be asking is, with limited resources, and we have limited resources, what's the best way to spend them? To make sure that we have a reliable grid, to make sure that we can mitigate against whether weather or climate change events and mitigate the problem of hurricanes and tornadoes and floods, that type of thing. One thing we can do is stop building in flood zones, account for the external costs, the externalities when it comes to building expensive properties on the coastal regions. Don't expect the federal government coming in and bail you out. So there's some common sense things we can do there. I'll ask Dr. Tierney, Dr. Kiernan, did you guys know how much we've spent in total trying to mitigate climate change globally?
I don't have that number at my fingertips, but I would be happy to follow up with you.
I'd like to hear that. We did have one witness from AEI said there was a pretty good estimate, about $5 trillion. In the Inflation Reduction Act, the green energy component of that was CBO costed is about $400 billion, but Goldman Sachs said it's closer to about $1.2 trillion with a T. Throughout these hearings, we keep talking about different costs, a couple tens of billions here, 20 billion there, 50 billion there. We're talking $1,200 billion when I have no idea where that money is going to be spent. If it's going to be spent to mitigate climate change, I would argue it's probably going to be misspent, because I don't think there's anything we can really do to hold back the tides. If we've already spent $5 trillion, people are still, hair on fire, concerned that the world's going to end in 12 years. It's not. Governor Bell Edwards, what you were talking about, the success you're having in Louisiana is a mitigation efforts, correct? I mean, wouldn't you like a more certain portion of that $1.2 trillion to use to mitigate against hurricanes? as opposed to $1.2 trillion spent on wind, solar. I don't know how cost-effective those things are going to be, what that's going to do, and I'll ask later, Ms. Espy, how does that affect the grid? But Governor Bill Edwards.
Well, I guess I have a difference of opinion with you, Senator. Louisiana is the most adversely affected state when it comes to climate change, and we produce more CO2 per capita than just about any other state in the nation. And I think we need to be acting on both fronts.
Do you think China or India are going to give up fossil fuels?
I'm not sure what they will do, Senator. I was taught to lead by example and from the front.
Sure. But 80% of our power is generated by fossil fuels, and we actually had a majority witness say that that's not going to change either. So again, we're just denying reality.
I'm not an
Aspie.
enemy of fossil fuels. We've been a fossil fuel state for over 100 years. But it's clear to me if we're going to be an energy state in the next 50 years, we're going to embrace the transition. We will reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, increase our reliance on clean energy such as wind
I just think
and solar.
that's just not recognizing reality or economic reality.
And maybe 40% of our power is from non-carbon emitting
Ms.
power.
Aspie, I want to ask you, to what extent does the wind power, solar power, what does that do in terms of grid reliability?
Yeah, look, wind and power does provide certain benefits to the transmission grid. It's available at times, other units are not available. Look, the transmission grid, the concept is, is if you have it available across a broad regional, interregional infrastructure, when you don't have capacity or availability in one location, it's available somewhere else. You need the transmission infrastructure in order to transport the electrons to where it needs to go. We see benefits from wind and solar. There are times when wind and solar is not available. The sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. Just no different than, we need gas plants. We need diversity, we need optionality. Ultimately, diversity and optionality from a long-term perspective is going to be the best mechanism for our long-term energy security.
One of my concerns when I was Chairman of Homeland Security was the threat of EMP. I realize it's low probability but highly catastrophic, but even GMD. And I've been trying to get studies, I've been trying to get information, strategies in terms of what we need to do. From my standpoint, one of the most common sense things to do would be to actually purchase and put in place large power transformers. Couldn't even get that in the current NDAA. Apparently there's some study that was part of the infrastructure bill, but there's no end date. We did talk to one transformer company, probably about 30,000 large power transformers. It costs about $60 to $90 billion to produce those and have them in place. Would that make sense from your standpoint, Ms. Aspie, because we would not be able to replace those power transformers in the event of either an EMP or a GMD event, correct?
There is a certain limited inventory of spare transformers across the country. Certainly, we have agreements with our neighboring utilities. Should indeed there be such an event that we need a transformer. Look, this country was built with many different voltage levels. So while I may have a certain transformer specification, my neighbor may have a different one. The other real issue from a transformer perspective is there's no domestic manufacturing of high voltage transformers in this country. We depend on the supply from other nations to supply our high voltage electric transformers.
So that is a huge vulnerability, and I guess what I'm arguing with limited resources, I would much rather see us spend $60 to $90 billion to purchase those now, put those in place offline in case you have one of those high catastrophic events, but we're not doing that. I think it's unfortunate because we're, again, trying to hold back the tide, spending $1.2 trillion, and it's just not going to work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Padilla, particularly grateful that Senator Padilla is here, given the infrastructure issues California is facing after the climate-driven wildfires and its effect on transmission. Thank you very much, Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Don't go stealing my intro. In many ways, I do refer to California as Exhibit A on the climate crisis for the reasons Chairman Whitehouse just mentioned and so many more. So I want to begin with that, maybe, knowing that California is the bellwether for the climate crisis, whether it's feeling and responding to the immediate impacts of extreme heat on our most vulnerable, flooding and what it means for our drinking water and agricultural production, the impact of fire and smoke on communities, let alone other agricultural products, we have to not just respond to short-term impacts, but prepare for long-term impacts of our changing climate. Just last week, the New York Times asked what many refer to as the trillion-gallon question. Not the million-dollar question, the trillion-gallon question. But what happens if California's dams fail as a result of extreme weather? If recent disasters are any indicator, we can predict it's a loss of life and property, it's damaged critical infrastructure and vital public facilities, valuable agricultural land is likely to be taken out of production, let alone disruptions to California's water supply and more. So the better question, I think the more responsible question, is what kind of investments are needed to prevent such catastrophic events and reduce the impact on communities. Governor Edwards, appreciate your comments about the impacts of both acute shocks like hurricanes and flooding, as well as chronic stressors like sea level rise and extreme heat. So you know better than anybody, not only does the buck stop with you, we have an opportunity to try to get ahead of it through front-end investments. Can you talk a little bit more about the proactive adaptation measures that have been taken, any related research and innovation efforts in the space?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I am very happy to talk about it because some of the most generous and significant transformative investments anywhere in the country have happened in Louisiana because of the generosity largely of the federal government and taxpayers all over the country, and we are certainly thankful. And of course, we have our non-federal share that we contribute towards that. But in instance after instance, it's making a positive impact. And these upfront investments, while very costly, they save an awful lot of money on the back end because we are not having to go back and rebuild communities and have housing programs and so forth that we had to have before. This can be demonstrated with the Hurricane Storm Damage Risk Reduction System, $14.5 billion investment in the greater New Orleans area. The 2021 storm, Ida, was stronger than Katrina, but because we had this new system, we had nowhere near the damages. For example, other systems have greatly reduced. I think you may not have been here, but with the protection systems put in place along the coast that were authorized by the Corps, we actually reduced the number of structures inundated with water from 11,000 with a 9-foot surge in that area in 2005 to 11 in 2019. So these investments absolutely work, and they save money over the long run, not just in rebuilding costs, but you have less interruption. When Hurricane Ida hit, for example, 15% of the nation's refining capacity was offline. 50% of the state's refining capacity, but 15%. If you can reduce the frequency of those events and the duration of those events, you save an awful lot of money and you avoid a lot of losses and costs to the economy as well.
It's the old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yes, sir.
And so being smart and strategic with those front-end investments do pay a huge dividend, not if, but when major disasters happen. And I appreciate you pointing to examples of the foresight of not just rebuilding to what was, but rebuilding to new, better, safer standards.
Based on the conditions you expect to see in 20 or 30 years.
Exactly.
With 1.5 to 2.5 feet of sea level rise, for example.
So a couple of other things. I did want to note, I know the chairman asked you about coastal erosion. That was an area I was going to bring up, but for the record, do you want to highlight the specific challenges in what is referred to in Southern California as the low sand corridor? The coastal area between San Diego and San Luis Obispo, which crosses Orange County, Los Angeles County, Ventura County, impacted infrastructure along the way. It's not just communities and homes and businesses, but important rail lines, second busiest rail region, second only to the Northeast Corridor. So an important one, I think, that the country should be concerned about. Lastly, as my time is up, I do want to just ask Dr. Keenan a quick question about how long-term drought and extreme heat contribute to the speed and deterioration or changes in wear and tear of critical infrastructure, specifically water infrastructure, knowing that not just in California but throughout the West, water supply, reliability, and affordability is so key?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I had the privilege of serving the people of California previously and advising on matters of climate, and this is certainly and indeed a challenge to water infrastructure in California. I'll highlight a couple of things, and there's a wonderful CISA report at DHS on this particular issue that I would draw reference to. One, when we have high and low water levels, that has impacts on the cycling of the equipment. Particularly low levels, because when it rains, it pours, right? And the problem is either too much or not enough water. But when we have drought conditions, we have equipment that's not being properly cycled and maintained, for instance, so you need to use it to maintain it in many ways. Also, we lose biomass, right? Grass, trees, they dry up, and we get more sedimentation. That sedimentation clogs filters, it clogs pumps, it creates a number of different problems. And finally, we rely more on surface water for drinking water, irrigation, and the like, as opposed to groundwater. And as we move to surface water, we begin to take on more of that sedimentation. So there's systematic hydrological impacts there. And with that surface water, we also have to pull out all the pollution that comes from stormwater, for instance. So we're getting hit at multiple levels of the system that impairs not only the quantity of moving water, but the quality of moving water.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, just in closing, I want to confirm with Governor Edwards. It is Governor Edwards, correct? I think I've heard Governor Bell Edwards by some of my colleagues earlier in the hearing. You deserve the respect of the proper recognition.
Yes,
Thank you, Mr.
yes,
Chair.
sir. Thank you.
Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I come from Indiana and ran a business for 37 years, logistics and distribution. It's been a big benefit to get engaged in conversations like this. Our company was so small for so long. You had duties to where you did everything in that business. For instance, CFO, CEO wasn't even a term we used until maybe 20 years ago, and I did it for 37. It was a blessing to have that practical kind of experience, especially when you get into a discussion here in the Budget Committee, and we're talking about climate. I view it as an issue that we definitely need to be engaged in on our side of the aisle. I started the Climate Caucus here when they'd attempted to do that for many years. It is valid. Conservatives need to be involved with it, from young conservatives to farmers who are at the leading edge of what might be afoot, from evangelicals to Catholics. But then it gets down to the rubber meeting the road. Because if I wasn't really good at Finance 101, I would have never succeeded in that business in the long run. Here we are, the biggest business in the world, and we do not do budgets anymore. We haven't done one that we've adhered to in 20-some years. We've got these big sweeping issues that the country looks to us to be at least civil in the discussion, and then maybe come up with some stuff that works. I don't think borrowing now $1.5 trillion, soon to be $2 trillion a year, is a good business plan. Governor, you'd get run out of town with that approach in your own state. We got to do better. Since it's a budget hearing, I generally start there. Now I want to pivot to climate, which is a complicated discussion. My side of the aisle, when I got here, you mentioned climate, you'd clear the room. You mentioned things like tax pricing and so forth. Then you're going to get the mysterious texts, like have you gone to the dark side, stuff like that. We've come a ways there. But still, we're in the context of all solutions generally wanting to be crafted here, but we're in the worst place we've ever been as a country to really do it. And I would suggest that, Governor, many people that run budgets live within your means, that we should maybe be doing more of that in places where get things done. And you pay for it, and you don't borrow from future generations. I'm going to give you an example in my home state. 2 lakes that on the bottom end of one had an endangered mussel, okay? You had to make sure water flow was going to keep them alive. Well, as a consequence, it, through a couple drought years, drained the lakes by 10 feet. And the big stakeholders were not necessarily the mussels, not even the utility that had a small hydroelectric presence, and believe me, they wish they didn't have it on that lake. FERC and Fish and Wildlife. Can you imagine what that discussion was like in trying to actually have people that live there, the businesses that lived around those lakes as the main stakeholders, been wrestling for 10 years with that confluence of issues? Well, we heard about it. I'm a Main Street entrepreneur that knows how to get from here to there, and in a little over a year, we solved it. And the way we had to solve it was not by relying on this place or even the various interests working it out. We had to step in as a Senate office. And it took a little over a year and a half to get it to the finish line, but they've been wrestling with it 10 years. So I think the point I'm making here is a lot of what we need to do related to this discussion, permitting and so forth, probably is going to have to be enabled more through the dynamics of what work in this country. And that's not doing it from this place directed from the top down. Maybe if you'd start doing things where you're creating more results. You can't do everything there, and a lot of times these things get tangled up with the process in general. 10 years working on a simple thing where mussels were a concern. I'm a conservationist. Well, we got a different flow rate that was more than what the Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to do. FERC really was kind of an issue that complicated more than enabled. Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to maybe get some resolution, and we helped the people that had the most skin in the game. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Hergott, what do we do in terms of taking the complexity of these issues and maybe trying to do them in ways that are a little more entrepreneurial, get the job done, navigate through the federal morass, and actually start producing more results where we don't have overburdening regulations and we quit borrowing money from future generations for whatever your interest might be here?
Two quick things. First, there are always going to be conflicts between the natural environment and human activity, and it's a balance. There's always trade-offs. Our inability to recognize that we have to make risk-based decisions and that there will be take on species and there will be impacts on the environment, but we can mitigate those, is why we have the environmental review processes we do. They're not rhetorical tools to stop projects or increase costs. The second is there is a disconnect between what people are paying for their utilities and their services and how they got there. When I asked 2,000 state legislators on what the unit of measure is for electricity, water, gas, they don't even know what the unit of measure is, let alone how much it costs or how much of that is attributable to permitting delays or litigation or costs and restarts and penalty fees. Without that connection, without that recognition of a holistic approach of what it takes, we're always going to be at loggerheads with each other, with people with their own constituencies. I'm American Rivers, I don't like hydro. I'm this, I don't like this. And as a result, because we haven't figured it out up here, we allow all of the siloed, unique constituencies that everyone looks out for to command the airspace.
Thank you. Good answer. And if I'd have the latitude for one other quick question.
Keep it quick because we have another senator waiting.
Yes, I understand that. This was Monticello, Indiana, Lake Freeman, by the way, a very rural area. And my next question is for the governor. What have you done in your own state that would cut to the chase, solve some of these issues where we know that you get it done more quickly than oftentimes from here to the top down? You have an example or two that you'd want to cite?
Well, I've got one that Mr. Hergott was involved in. The largest ecosystem restoration project in our state's history, one of the largest in the country, and certainly the largest sediment diversion project ever undertaken is the Mid-Barataria project in the lower Mississippi River. The estimates initially were that was going to be 12 to 15 years of permitting, potentially followed by litigation and so forth. Well, 5 years ago, we got started. Next month, we're going to break ground. It was on the dashboard. it received attention and it was transparent. He helped usher it through the process. We had a lot of coordination among the federal agencies. And so I believe in permitting reform too, by the way. I co-chaired an effort with the National Governors Association with Spencer Cox, the governor of Utah. It is very bipartisan. Every governor in the country is concerned about this. It just simply takes too long now to do anything. But this is an example of how things can work. And so let's do more of what works and less of what doesn't work.
Touche. Kudos. Thank you.
Senator Lujan.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, our ranking member. Thank you both for holding this hearing. Dr. Tierney, thank you for being here. To every one of you, thank you for being here as well. Governor Edwards, honored to see you as well, sir. Dr. Tierney, among the many important roles that you have held, I see that you served as Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Energy. In that role and other roles that you've held in the energy sector, I assume you, like me, you came to recognize the important role of our national labs, not just for the country, but for benefits around the world. And as you know, New Mexico is home to two important national labs with Los Alamos National Laboratory and Sandia National Laboratory. Dr. Tierney, my question is, can you share with the committee some of the ways that our national labs help protect our nation's critical infrastructure?
Thank you for that great question. I'm really happy to talk about the great national laboratory network that we have in the United States. Of course, you mentioned the two in New Mexico. They are probably very well known for their contributions to the nation's national security, but they also have done tremendous work on energy infrastructure issues. I think in particular of Sandia's work on cybersecurity and making sure that the nation's energy infrastructure is more resilient as well as capable of withstanding attacks that are predictable, going to happen all the time on the nation's electric infrastructure, for example. Sandia is a great example of that. North of New Mexico in Colorado is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I have the honor of serving as their external advisory committee chair. They do tremendous work on analyzing the potential benefits of a regional electric system where there are better interconnections between the region, allowing for much greater diversity of electric demand and electric supply. I could go on and on, but the nation's labs are truly jewels. Their support by Congress and appropriations through the Department of Energy's many offices is critical to the nation's infrastructure.
I appreciate that. Well, I'm going to ask you to go on, Dr. Tierney, with my next question, which is related to our national labs. But do you agree that finding solutions to climate change, such as designing climate-resilient infrastructure, is a responsibility that we should invest in at our national labs, given the material science, the planning, the modeling of oceans? And it turns out for the national security missions of these labs, they need to know what's happening and where the wind blows for obvious reasons. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. The R&D capabilities of the labs that span quite basic science on materials, strength, and capacity to withstand different stresses, all the way to deployment of infrastructure and all along that supply chain is extremely important. The labs are very well known for their basic science work, again, on high energy physics. But on practical infrastructure issues, the materials work and analytics that are done make their way eventually into private industry, into the hands of companies that are actually putting infrastructure on the ground. So I didn't know this question was coming, and I love hitting it because they are truly essential to the nation's energy security and national security.
I appreciate that, Dr. Tierney. Now, Dr. Keenan, I appreciate that you included in your testimony, and I quote, "The Southwest U.S. faces upwards of $1.4 trillion in lost GDP between 2022 and 2050 due to risks and costs of projected water scarcity challenges. Senator Padilla was asking you many questions in this particular area, talk about climate smart technologies, precision agriculture, soil erosion reduction that can result in some of these practices, minimizing fertilizer applications. If we had more modern infrastructure, precision agriculture, what that means as well to contribute to reduction with some of the devastation we see with climate as well. There's many efforts that many of us have been working on together. But Dr. Keenan, yes or no, in order to avoid the $1.4 trillion impact in the Southwest economy, do you agree that we urgently need to provide rural America with the tools and technology to adopt to climate change progression?
Yes.
Well, I appreciate that. And there's some other questions I have. One, a few, Governor Edwards, that I'll submit for you as well. But, Mr. Chairman, I want to be mindful of the time as well. And so I'm going to yield back, but I'll submit the rest into the record. I really appreciate you all being here and all the things that you do day in and day out. Thank you all. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Hergott has set the record for rapidity. Dr. Keenan has just set the record for brevity. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all to your testimony. I was thinking about an event last year where I'm at National Reagan Airport, and the pilot announced that we can't take off because it's too hot out, and our fuel load to get to Oregon means we may end up in the river if we try to take off. And so we had to wait for an hour and a half to unload gas or jet fuel off the plane. And then we had to land in Chicago to refuel to get to Oregon. And I'd heard about this sort of thing happening in Phoenix, where 110 degrees and with the heat, the air gets thinner, you don't have as much lift. But in Washington, D.C., I had never heard of this. Just on that particular issue, and I think I'm directing this to you, Dr. Keenan, are we seeing that heat is driving a problem with runways being too short? And is there a whole transportation infrastructure expansion that has to happen for jets to get off the ground?
Yes, we're seeing this different types of fleets, if you will, both cargo and domestic passenger fleets, particularly larger planes, transcontinental and overseas flights are limited, their payload and fuel capacity. And this is heat at the surface level, but also at different levels of the atmosphere that are creating essentially stronger headwinds or steering currents that burn more fuel in flight as well. This is a challenge not just for our domestic economy and infrastructure, it's also a challenge in terms of national security and the military, because we're going to have to expand airfields and the length of airfields really throughout our system. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge that the aviation industry is addressing by some measure in terms of efficiency, fuels, fleet design, et cetera, but at its core, we are going to have to extend the length of runways somewhere in the order of 20% the extension of the current lengths across the airport system.
Thank you. I think that's a piece many Americans would be surprised about. I wanted to turn to you, Governor Edwards. Thank you for joining us. The issues in my state from climate chaos are different than your state. My state, the forests are burning, the snowpack in the Cascades has lost 240 inches over the last 90 years. The drought is affecting ranchers and farmers, the pine beetles. It's almost apocalyptic set of plagues. But I believe in your state it's more about hurricanes, rising sea levels, coastal erosion. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yes, sir, that's fair, but we are impacted by things that wouldn't be intuitively obvious. So, for example, because of the drought in Iowa and elsewhere, we have a low river. That's allowing salt water to come in from the Gulf and compromise drinking water for communities in Louisiana who have always taken their drinking water out of the river. And so we're having to do emergency work, the state, the parishes, but also working with the Corps of Engineers, and we really appreciate their help, in order to build sills in order to stop the salt water and so forth. So it is a myriad of things, and things that happen in one part of the country actually have a cascading effect in other parts of the country.
Just for the drinking water challenge, are you looking at billions of dollars of infrastructure changes?
No, sir, it's not that expensive. Now, obviously, if this becomes something that repeats itself too frequently, obviously a more permanent solution would have to be found. It's happened before, but it last happened just a couple of years ago. So if we see this happening more frequently, then we're going to have to do something that would be more expensive. Yes, sir.
And then I believe I've seen stories about your coastal lands eroding, and are there investments in adaptation that you're trying to kind of, if you will, hold the ocean back, or you just say, no, we can't, it's impossible? I thought I saw islands being created, more artificial islands, barriers,
yes, sir.
and so forth.
You know, we're having tremendous success with our Coastal Restoration and Protection Program, and it is a science-based program, and we are investing a minimum of $1 billion a year. And it's ecosystem restoration. And by the way, when you restore ecosystems, you provide storm surge buffer, and you actually protect populations and infrastructure. So it's actually protection. But we also have projects that are designed primarily for protection. But we're having success, and we believe that if we can implement our program as we envision it today, we will have less risk in 50 years than we do today. Even with the climate change happening, the sea level rise between, I think, 1.8 and 2.5 feet over the next 50 years, which is kind of the low and the medium estimate.
And in that ecosystem restoration, you're creating artificial or man-made barrier islands, and is that expensive?
Oh, yes, sir. It is very expensive, and we're creating, and for the most part, restoring the islands where they were and so forth. It is expensive, but it helps because that chew dissipates the storm surge and it provides buffer. It also provides habitat, for example, the brown pelicans. And you may have seen, what you saw was probably Queen Bess Island, but the brown pelican happens to be our state bird. It had, the areas where it would nest, it greatly reduced. Within a few weeks of us finishing this island, the birds were back. And so it serves a lot of purposes, but primarily that was done for protection.
Yeah. Well, I have plenty more I could ask, but my time's up. Thank you very much.
And the witnesses are willing to take questions for the record. Before I recognize Senator Kennedy, let me just point out that makes 3 Louisianans in the room, so who knows how this ends up. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Governor. Professor Keenan, you teach at Tulane?
Yes, sir, I do. I have that privilege.
And you have your own website, KeenanClimate.com, is that right?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. And you describe yourself on your website as a globally recognized thought leader. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you give paid speeches, do you?
On occasion, I do.
You have your own agent, I believe, according to your website, Lee Bureau?
This is correct.
And how much do you charge per speech?
It varies depending on the audience, the amount of preparation work that goes, and the amount of follow-through. Usually,
the last paid speech you gave, how much did you receive?
I'm happy to follow up on.
You don't remember?
I do not.
Do you give that money to Tulane?
I do not.
You keep it?
Yes, this is outside of my capacity as a professor.
Right.
As is
Now,
standard course.
you recently sent a letter you recently joined a lot of other academics. You signed a letter demanding that elite institutions and universities stop accepting money from fossil fuel companies. Is that correct?
This is correct.
You consider Tulane an elite university?
I would like to think that we have a high standard of excellence in our education and our research.
Okay. Well, the Murphy family of Murphy Oil and the Deming family of Murphy Oil have recently given Tulane $25 million. Have you called on Tulane to give that money back?
Well, It's not, they didn't give that money to my unit or the department or school that I work
Have you
in.
called on Tulane to give that money back, or you think that's okay for them to keep it?
It's their prerogative, not mine.
Okay. But you think, but yet you just signed a letter saying that all elite universities should refuse fossil fuel money. Is that, did you put a footnote in there and say, except my own?
Well, what I'd like to say, Senator, is that I believe it raises a conflict of interest for those that research climate change that are supported by the fossil fuel
Yeah,
industry.
but then why don't you ask Tulane to give the $25 million back?
Well, I think in the context, if that money were to be used to support climate research, information, disinformation, or whatever it may be, then that may be an appropriate conflict of interest. But I think in the context of which
You don't
Tulane is
see the
doing,
hypocrisy here?
it is hypocrisy in those that may read and interpret it as such. I see
Maybe it's like Washington. If there weren't double standards, there wouldn't be standards at all. Let me ask you this. You also participated in another article here criticizing Houston for building new buildings and McMansions. And you said, I'm going to read your quote. I don't want to misquote you, Professor. That means we have to change our consumer preferences. You could have a super efficient, energy efficient mega mansion in Houston or the suburbs, but it's still a mansion. You're still over consuming space. Did you say that?
Yes, sir. That's based on work as a member of the IPCC. Our research suggested that reducing our footprint in terms of total spatial footprint would have significant impacts on the decarbonization of the built environment.
And so you're saying that people should live in smaller houses because larger houses contribute to CO2 emissions?
100%, Senator.
Okay. Well, recently, Tulane finished the Commons. It was 77,000 square feet, $55 million. Recently, Tulane finished the Gold Ring Woldenberg Business Complex, $35 million to complete, 92,000 square feet. Boy, that's a McMansion. Mustapher Hall, 23,000 square feet. Paul Hall, 36,000 square feet. Richardson Hall, 50,000 square feet. Housing redevelopment phase 1, 230,000 square feet at Tulane. Have you called upon Tulane to stop these buildings?
Sir, the habitable space within those units are roughly the size of the conference room back there and are indeed quite small.
But they contribute to, does
everything that we do,
does
sir.
the Commons contribute more to climate change than a McMansion in Houston? You were pretty quick to criticize the people of Houston for wanting to build, you thought, McMansions. But you don't criticize your own university?
I don't find that to be equivocal comparison between space meant for students who must reside at a university.
You don't see
and
the
those
hypocrisy in that?
It is your finding and interpretation, sir.
But you don't see the irony of the hypocrisy?
I'm going to go ahead and say no.
Okay. I kind of gathered that would be your answer. Governor, good to see you. You live in a big house, don't you?
Currently, I do, yes, sir.
How big is the governor's mansion?
I don't know the square footage, but it's large, and it's 60 years old this year. You ought to come by and
I need to
see
get
the
by.
work.
Well, the professor from Tulane doesn't like that. Let me ask you, do you think it's fair? Look, John Bell, we get 37.5% of offshore royalties under Go Mesa. New Mexico gets 50% share from the federal government, for God's sakes. Wyoming gets 50%. North Dakota gets 50%. We get 37.5%, and we got to share it with 4 other states.
And it's capped at $375 million that we get to share no matter.
Yeah.
Yes. So
Now, that just sucks.
I don't think it's fair, and 90% of all Gulf oil and gas exploration production activities are served out of Port Fourchon. So we bear the brunt of the infrastructure necessary to make all of that happen, but we're not sharing the way other states share, and it's one of the reasons I thank the members of this committee while you were out for the ones who co-sponsored the RISE Act, because it is incredibly important for a state like Louisiana, and we constitutionally dedicate every dollar we get, as you know, to the coast.
All we're asking is to be treated like everybody else, aren't we?
Yes, sir.
And we have a solution, don't we?
We do.
And it's called the RISE Act. Tell us about the RISE Act.
Well, it's a wonderful piece of legislation that we are obviously hoping that you pass, not only for the benefits that you just mentioned, but currently there's no revenue sharing mechanism in place in federal law with respect to wind. We'll have the first offshore wind lease sale next month. And so this is a very real thing for us, especially as we look at the loss of the BP Horizon fines that have been paying. In fact, the Mid-Barataria, $2.9 billion paid for with BP dollars. But those go away in 2031. We really need to replace that revenue, and wind energy gives us an opportunity, but we need that structure in place, and I appreciate your work on that.
Well, to be blunt, we've proven we can use the money well, and we've put our own money up, and it is patently unfair that other states get a larger share, much larger share than Louisiana. And I think the RISE Act, which will also help our wind industry, as Senator Whitehouse knows, we're working together on, is long overdue. And I appreciate you coming up here to talk about that bill. I was in Judiciary, that's why I was late. And the chairman's been very generous with allowing me to go over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Not a problem, Senator Kennedy. Glad to have you here with your governor present. And I would note that your colleague, Senator Cassidy, is also an extremely energetic and lively proponent of the RISE bill, and we continue to work together, Governor, with your delegation to try to make sure that we can get this bill passed through ENR with the support of your former gubernatorial colleague, now Senator Manchin, and we're continuing to make progress. With that, let me say that the questions for the record that need to be filed must be in by noon tomorrow. And if the witnesses would be kind enough to respond to any questions for the record you may receive within 7 days, we would appreciate it. I want to thank the ranking member for a particularly good panel and a particularly helpful hearing, and offer my particular gratitude to Governor Edwards, whose schedule I know is enormously busy and who has come a long way to be here. We're extremely grateful to you, sir. With that, the hearing is adjourned.